Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and let me welcome you to the second day of the workshop on macroeconomic modeling for small and open economies. My name is Ariel Boskin. I am senior manager of the Central Bank of Economic Studies, and today I will be moderating the sessions. We will have three presentations today. The first one will be José Luis Oreiro, who will be presenting, then Fabio Freitas, and finally Gabriel Michelena. The workshop will finish with the closing words by our chief economist, Herman Feldman. The first presentation will be done by José Luis Oreiro, who holds a PhD in Economics of Industry and Technology from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's currently Associate Professor of the Department of Economics of the University of Brasilia, Level IB Researcher at National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, and Senior Member of the Post-Keynesian Economic Society. He's also the leader of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. His work has been published in many international peer-reviewed journals. The name of the paper today will be Flexible Inflation Targeting, Real Exchange Rate and Structural Change in a Caldarian Model with Balance of Payments Constrained Growth. And it's a joint paper written with Luciano Díaz de Carvalho, Luciano Ferreira Gabriel, and Evaldo Enrique da Silva. All of them members of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group and professors of the University of Viçosa. When you want to start, José Luis, the floor is yours.
Well, many thanks. Good morning for everyone. I would to thank the kindly invitation of Ariel Boskin to present today in the Central Bank of Argentina, an institution which the first general manager was Howell Prebisch, the greatest Latin American economist of all times. So it's a great honor for me. So let me share my presentation. Okay. Share. Well, so this workshop by members of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. Well, I think that the first question that we have to answer before presenting the model is how to model a small open economy. In order to answer this question, we have to have several issues in mind. The first issue, the first important issue, is regarding the elasticity of labor supply. We can have two cases: a mature economy where labor supply is inelastic and balanced growth requires equality between natural growth rate, warranted growth rate, and actual growth rate, or a dual economy where labor supply is unlimited in the sense of Lewis in his work of 1954, which means that growth is limited only by growth of capital stock. The second issue is about the nature of the technological progress. Technological progress can be exogenous, so the growth rate of labor productivity is exogenous and independent of the actual growth rate of real output. For instance, this is exactly what happens in Solus One models of exogenous growth. Or technological progress can be endogenous. The growth rate of labor productivity depends on the actual growth rate of real output due to the existence of a dynamic economies of scale and or the fact that the rate of employment due to the entrepreneur's search for labor-saving technical progress as a result of increases in the real wages or in wage share. The third issue is regarding the level of openness of capital account. We have three possible cases. The first one, the capital account is closed. In this case, interest rate differentials had no influence over capital flows or hence over the rate of change of nominal exchange rate. We have an intermediate case where capital account is open but imperfect. Interest rate differential result in a positive but finite rate of change of capital flows and hence over the rate of change of nominal exchange rate. And finally, we have the book case, the textbook case, perfect capital mobility in Mondel's sense, where arbitrage operations between foreign and domestic investors make the domestic interest rate to be equal to the level of international rate of interest plus the country risk premium. Another issue is the nature of tradable goods. Tradable goods could be homogeneous throughout the world, so the law of one price holds, which means that real exchange rate is constant at the level given by the purchasing power parity. Or tradable goods are imperfect substitutes, which means that domestic and foreign goods can be different prices. In this case, real exchange rate is no longer constant, but can change as a result of changes in the monopoly power of domestic firms or changes in the unit labor costs of manufacturing industries. Another issue is about the exchange rate regime. We have two cases. The first one, the one that Argentina used in the 90s during Carlos Menem government, is a fixed exchange rate. The monetary authorities set the level of nominal exchange rate that is considered ideal for policy purposes. Or we can have a managed floating. In the case of managed floating, the nominal exchange rate changes due to capital flows, but monetary authorities can intervene in the exchange market by means of accumulation of international reserves. This was the case of Brazil, for instance, from 2006 to 2013. Other issue is about the goals of monetary policy. I think that we can have basically nowadays two goals or two frameworks for monetary policy. The first one is what I call strict inflation targeting. That is the case of Brazil. Monetary authority only or most important goal is to make actual inflation equal to some numerical target for CPI variation over some length of time. In Brazil, the time length is 1 year. Or we can have a flexible way inflation targeting, where monetary authorities have implicitly or explicitly a double mandate, is to stabilize inflation at the target level and capacity utilization at potential or desired level. Finally, the last issue is for post-Keynesian economists is particularly relevant, which is the source of autonomous demand growth. We have basically two sources, domestic demand that can be private or government consumption. I think that is the most preferred source of autonomous demand growth for Fabio Freitas and the people of the Russian Supermultiplier, or foreign demand, which means exports, which is the preferable source of autonomous demand growth for new developmentalist Brazilian school of thought. Well, now the standard models for open economies. I think that the first standard model is the Caldarian cumulative causation models, which seminal paper is the Dixon-Tiro paper of 1975. These models have in general 4 equations. A first equation where the growth rate of real output is a function of the growth rate of exports. A second equation in which the growth rate of exports is a function of the rate of change of terms of trade and the growth rate of world's income. A third equation that specifies the productivity growth rate as a function of the growth rate of real output, which is a simple formalization of Calder-Verdun's law. And the fourth equation, where the rate of change of domestic prices is determined by the rate of change in nominal wages, the growth rate of productivity, and the rate of change of nominal exchange rate. Well, these models has a problem because they are not in general compatible with a balance of payments constraint, a fact that is admitted by Anthony Tyrrell himself. Well, the second standard model is the balance of payments constrained growth models. For open economies with closed capital account, which is the seminal paper of Tyrrell in 1979, the growth rate of real output is given by the ratio of demand elasticities of exports and imports multiplied by the growth rate of foreign income. For open economy with open capital accounts, for instance, in the paper of Moreno Bride, published in Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics in 1998-1999, the growth rate of real output depends not only on the income elasticities and the growth rate of foreign income, but also on the initial ratio of exports to imports, which can be shown to be equal to the ratio between exports to GDP and the sum of current account deficits to GDP and exports to GDP. And in this case, an increase in the current account deficit to GDP will reduce the growth rate of real output compatible with balance of payments equilibrium. This I showed in my 2016 book written. There are problems with balance of payments constrained growth models. First, these models fully regards the cumulative causation mechanism as so relevant for Caldarian growth models, assuming constant terms of trade, then productivity gains induced by economic growth had no role in the dynamics of the system in such a way that they become strictly irrelevant. However, in this case, the system no longer has any adjustment mechanism between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This deficiency was observed by Pele on his 2002 article, for whom the balance of payments constrained growth model would be inconsistent in the extent that only in a happy coincidence would be possible the equality between the growth rate compatible with the balance of payments equilibrium and the natural growth rate, that is, the one that keeps the unemployment rate constant over time. In this way, the balance of payments constrained growth models does not seem in general compatible with a balanced growth path. Last but not least, the balance of payments constrained growth models fully neglected the relationship between the level of real exchange rate and long-term growth. Indeed, in those models, the long-term equilibrium growth rate depends on the ratio of exports and import income elasticities multiplied by the rest of the world growth rate. Thus, real exchange rate variations are assumed irrelevant to long-term growth, either because empirical evidence shows that export and import price elasticities are low in such way that the impact of real devaluation of exchange rate over the growth path of exports and imports is low, either because the terms of trade do not show a systematic trend of appreciation or depreciation in the long term. Well, then I have an alternative that I have been working since 2018 in a seminal paper published in the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy, written by me and my former master student, Bernardo Santana. We developed a Caldarian growth model that, one, incorporates the balance of payments constraint, eliminating the inconsistency presented on balance of payments constrained growth models. Two, establish a mechanism by which the level of real exchange rate may affect the long-term growth of capitalist economies. Santana and Oreiro 2018 model incorporates some innovations introduced by myself in an article published in 2009 into the structure of Caldarian growth models, such as the conduction of monetary policy in inflation targeting regime, nominal interest rate determined by a Taylor rule, a floating exchange rate regime, and imperfective capital mobility. In contrast to the Oreiro 2009 model. However, Santana and Oreiro 2018 model assume a balance of payments constraint in which the growth rate of international capital inflows is a positive function of the differential between the domestic interest rate and international interest rate plus the country risk premium. In this context, the differential between the domestic and the international interest rates plus the risk premium will also determine the rate of depreciation or appreciation of the nominal exchange rate. Another important innovation introduced in the model was the hypothesis that the Calder-Verdun coefficient, which captures the sensibility of the rate of growth of labor productivity with respect to the rate of growth of real output, depends on the manufacturing share on output. This hypothesis allowed to introduce into the model the possibility of a structural change, which is understood as a dynamic process by which the manufacturing share of output changes over time. In this way, it was possible to analyze the dynamic properties of the model, both in the case where the productivity structure is kept constant and in a situation in which it changes due to some economic process. Well, so the model that I made for the conference is a new Caldarian model with balance of payments, constrained growth. What are the properties of the model? First of all, we will assume that monetary policy is conducted under a flexible inflation targeting regime, where the goal of the monetary policy is not only to achieve a certain target for inflation, but also stabilize the pace utilization at its potential or target level. Second, we will assume that potential or target level of capacity utilization depends on lagged variable of this variable. This hypothesis captures the hysteresis effect of lower output growth over potential output, which is a phenomena well documented in recent literature. Finally, we will assume that inflation expectations depend on the credibility of the central bank. In the case where central bank is fully credible, then inflation expectations are equal to the target inflation. Otherwise, they are determined by a simple adaptive rule, which will introduce a level of inflation inertia in the model. In the long run equilibrium with the structural change, it was shown, that's the main result, that a decrease in the target inflation could increase the growth rate of real output, the capacity utilization, the rate of employment, and the manufacturing share in GDP, becoming a driver of the process of structural change. So you can see that the model shows a positive correlation between the growth rate of real output and the manufacturing share. That's an important feature of this model, and a feature that is compatible with the empirical findings of the relevant literature. Since monetary policy can affect the productive structure of the economy, as well as the growth rate of real output and the rate of employment, then it is not possible to separate macroeconomics from economic development, which is the core of the so-called structuralist development macroeconomics, which is the theoretical basis of the Brazilian new developmentalist school. Well, some other remarks about the model. Although the model was developed for a small open economy, it is designed for a mature economy in the sense of Lewis. Labor supply is inelastic, and real output growth has to be equal to the natural growth rate in the long run. The natural growth rate is, however, endogenous because productivity growth depends both on output growth and employment rate. So the natural growth rate adjusts itself to the actual growth rate of real output determined by the balance of payments constraint due to changes in the level of employment. And finally, in order for a balanced growth path to exist, it was also necessary to make the autonomous component of investment demand an endogenous variable in the long run, as done by Lavoie in his 2016 paper in Macroeconomica. Well, I think, Ariel, how much time I have?
You have 15 minutes left.
Oh, 50 minutes, all right. So I will present briefly the structure of the model. Basically, the model have 3 or 4 blocks of equations. Equations 1, 2, and 3 represents the balance of payments constraint. Equation 1, the dynamic equation for exports. Equation 2, the dynamic equation for imports. The equation 3 is the balance of payments constraint, assuming capital inflows, where the growth rate of capital inflows is F hat. The growth rate of capital inflows, F hat, is determined in the equation 4 by the interest rate differential, where F measures the degree of openness of capital account. Equation 5 relates the rate of change of nominal exchange rate with capital inflows. If capital inflows are positive, then the exchange rate will appreciate over time. The coefficient K measures the intervention of the level of intervention of central bank in the exchange rate market. The equation 6 is the Taylor's rule for a flexible inflation targeting. Beta 0 is the equilibrium exchange rate for an open economy, which is equal to the international interest rate plus country risk premium. Equation 7 shows that the target or normal or whatever what you can say target utilization rate had an hysteresis effect. So it depends on the lagged variable of the capacity utilization. Equation 8 is the goods market equilibrium. We are assuming no government activities. Equation 9 is the consumption function. Equation 10 is a simple investment equation where the growth rate of capital stock depends on an autonomous component and the real expected interest rate. Equation 10a assumes that inflation expectations is equal to the target inflation. So we are assuming a fully credible monetary policy. Equation 11 shows the net exports as a ratio of the capital stock. Equation 14 shows the price setting of firms in an open economy. The level of prices depends on the real exchange rate, E, and nominal wage rate, and the level of productivity. Equation 15 defines the real wage relevant for consumers. Consumers consume both domestic and foreign goods, so there is a bundle of consumption goods. Equation 16 redefines the real wage relevant for consumers as dependent on the level of productivity and inversely with the real exchange rate. So an increase in productivity increases real wages, but depreciation of real exchange rate reduces real wage. V bar represents the target real wage by unions. LT is the employment rate. Equation 18 represents the wage inflation, which depends on target inflation and distributive conflict between unions and capitalists. And equation 19 represents the domestic inflation, which is a weighted average of international inflation and exchange rate variation, and plus the increase in unit labor cost. All right. And equation 20 is the productivity growth, which depends on the real growth rate and the level of employment lag in one period. So the model has a short run equilibrium that is represented by equations 1, 2, 3, 4a, 5b, 13a, and 21. I will skip that. Some properties of the short run equilibrium. Then we have a system of 7 independent equations with 7 unknowns. This means that we have a determinate system, but some observations are required to make about the system of equations. First of all, it allowed us to calculate the level of employment and capacity utilization, as well as the growth rate of real output. This is an important advance in respect with balance of payments, constrained growth models, where only the growth rate of real output can be determined, but not the general level of resources utilization. Second, the interdependence of equations of the model is not general. The model is block recursive in the sense of Sargent, 1987. Indeed, the short-run equilibrium values of capacity utilization and inflation rate could be entirely determined by equations 13a and 21 alone. Once these variables are determined, equations 4a and 5b determine the growth rate of capital flows and the rate of exchange rate depreciation. And once these values are determined, equations 1 and 3 determine the growth rate of imports, the growth rate of exports, and the growth rate of real output that is compatible with balance of payments equilibrium. So, how many time I had, Ariel?
You have 8 minutes.
All right. The balance growth is structural change. Well, in balance of growth, inflation rate is kept constant. Inflation expectations equal to target. Capital utilization, capacity utilization is constant. Growth rate of real output is constant. The manufacturing share is constant but exogenous, and the real exchange rate is constant but exogenous. So we have the system of equations for a balanced growth without a structural change. The important thing that I have to comment is that equation 31 is absolutely necessary for a balanced growth path to exist, which means that the growth rate of real output compatible with balance of payments equilibrium has to be equal to the growth rate of capital stock. In order for this equality to hold, the autonomous component of investment demand can be transformed in an endogenous variable in the long run, dependent on the difference between the growth rate of real output and the growth rate of capital stock. And equation 32a determines the steady state or balanced growth path of autonomous component of investment demand. Well, the model with structural change, equation 33, represents the dynamics of the manufacturing share. The dynamics of manufacturing share has 3 components. Our autonomous component are components that depends on the real exchange rate, and more importantly, it is an important advance in respect to the Brasser Pereira definition of industrial equilibrium exchange rate. I introduced the technological gap. For me, the industrial equilibrium exchange rate will be the level of real exchange rate that makes manufacturing share constant over time. So equation 34 determines the industrial equilibrium exchange rate that is no longer an ad hoc or exogenous variable to the model. Equation 35 then determines the dynamics of the manufacturing share, which can be simplified as the difference between the actual level of exchange rate and the equilibrium or industrial level of exchange rate. Equation 36b, the dynamics of real exchange rate, and the system, equation 39, the dynamics of real exchange rate in steady state. E dot has to be equal to 0, so we have equation 14. Well, the system, the dynamic system for structural change is represented in figure 2. It is a stable equilibrium. It is shown by Oleg theorem presented in the paper. The most interesting result is that the decrease in inflation target shift the E hat curve to the right, so increasing the steady state level of manufacturing share in output. And finally, table 1 represents the effects of changes in inflation targeting over the growth rate of real output, capacity utilization, employment rate, and manufacturing share. We show that a decrease in target inflation will increase the growth rate of real output, the steady state level of rate of employment, the steady state level of capacity utilization, and the steady state level of manufacturing share in GDP. So, summing up, the main objective of this paper was to show that monetary policy, especially the target inflation, can have a long-term influence on real output growth, capacity utilization, employment rate, and the productive structure of small open economies with imperfect capital mobility, flexible inflation targeting regime, and its stresses. With this goal, a Caldarian model of balance of payments constrained growth was developed, in which monetary policy, price and wage setting, productivity growth, and structural change has a central role in the interaction between inflation and economic growth. Although the model was developed for a small open economy, it is designed for a mature economy in the sense of yields. Labor supply is inelastic, and real output growth had to be equal to the natural growth rate in the long run. The natural growth rate is, however, endogenous, because productivity growth depends both on output growth and employment rate. The natural growth rate adjusts itself to the actual growth rate of real output, determined by the balance of payments constraint due to changes in the level of employment. In order for a balanced growth path to exist, it was also necessary to make the autonomous component of investment demand and endogenous available in the long run, as done by Lavoie. And finally, the main result of the model is that a reduction in the target inflation will result in an increase in the long run rate of real output, rate of employment, capacity utilization, and manufacturing share. This means that monetary policy is not neutral, which is a very post-Keynesian result, even in the long run, and has the capacity to permanently change the productive structure of the economy, increasing the manufacturing share. As the manufacturing share is decisive for the process of technological progress and economic development, it is clear that monetary policy is capable of affecting the development path of the economy. This means that it is not possible to separate macroeconomics from economic development. This conclusion is in accordance with those so-called structuralist development macroeconomics, which is the theoretical basis of the Brazilian New Developmental School. And this is my contact. Thanks very much for your time and patience.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis, for your nice presentation. Now we will pass to the comments by Gabriel Porchile from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. When you want.
Thank you, Ariel. How much time do I have?
You have from 5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure, and it's always nice to discuss a work by Jose Luis Oreiro, who is one of our leading post-Keynesian economists in Latin America, and it's always very much rewarding to read one of his papers. I have several minor comments, which I will send directly to Jose Luis, because I think we should take the opportunity to discuss the issues that are perhaps more central to the thesis of the paper. One thing that I would like to ask Jose Luis is that in some points in the paper, he suggests that the appreciation of the real exchange rate have a positive impact on the terms of trade, or better, there is a positive impact of in the terms of trade, which helps the growth rate of imports, and by doing so, it also contributes to sustain the rate of economic growth. So, clearly, terms of trade, appreciation of the real exchange rate are different things, but they are clearly very much overlapped. So to some extent, the paper suggests that indeed appreciation could be helpful for growth. And this is, of course, something which is at odds with the very message that other works by Jose Luis have sent in the past, in the sense that appreciations have a negative impact on the performance of the trade balance and on the balance of payments constraint rate of growth. So I can see the argument in terms of trade, but there is some kind of stylized fact in Latin America, at least in economic history, in which investment in capital goods have short-lived improvements in the short run out of an appreciation of the real exchange rate, but there is a negative effect on profits in the manufacturing sector, and in the long run, this ends with a negative impact on growth. So the assumption or the results of the model are somehow at odds with this evidence, in the sense that it is true that the terms of trade improve, but it is also true that there is a competitiveness effect of the appreciation, which may have the opposite consequences in the long run. So this is my first question. The second question is about the equilibrium exchange rate, which assumes that the share of manufacturing in value added is constant. I'm not so sure if this is a reasonable assumption, in the sense that you have the cases of countries like China, in which the share of the manufacturing sector may even increase in time, but also you have some processes of deindustrialization, or a fall in the share of manufacturing value added in advanced countries, in which more sophisticated services, high-tech services, become increasingly important in the production structure. And you may not say that in these cases the real exchange rate is not in this industrial equilibrium, because the process of deindustrialization that you see is not a premature deindustrialization, but some kind of natural process of deindustrialization. So in this sense, the definition provided in the paper about this this equilibrium industrial exchange rate might not be so convincing. The other thing that worries me is that it assumes that this is the real exchange rate that keeps constant the manufacturing share in value added in conditions in which the up-to-date technology is being used in the country. And this assumes somehow that the technology gap, the other variable that you are addressing in the paper, equals 1. I mean, there is no technology gap if you are assuming that all countries are indeed using the best technology, and hence perhaps attaining very similar levels of labor productivity. So this is also a tension that I noticed in the paper when you have this assumption about what means equilibrium industrial exchange rate. Two final comments. One is, I'm not so sure, Jose Luis, if it is fair to say that the balance of payments constraint growth models do not offer a way of adjusting output growth to the balance of payments constraint. I mean, Blecker basically have suggested the mechanism of changes in the autonomous investment as a way in which actual demand growth adjusts to the balance of payments constraint. I mean, there is an assumption that somehow autonomous investment reacts to deficits or surpluses in the trade balance so as to make the actual growth, effective growth, to converge towards the long-run equilibrium rate of growth given or associated with the balance of payments constraint. Carolyn Sosky, in the book, a more conventional book on macroeconomics, they also suggest this mechanism when they discuss the medium-run process of adjustment to external equilibrium. So this is something that I think that it is present in the literature. And Sean Robinson in 1967 also provides a strong argument exactly in this direction, which I think is good to not to challenge your assumption, but to associate or relate this assumption with a body of literature, which is, I think, important. So the last thing is that in your paper, it seems that to be more rigorous in terms of fighting inflation, basically to define an inflation target which is very low, which would appreciate to the at the end of the day, the exchange rate may be good in the long run. I'm not so sure if I understood correctly the message, but if this is the message, is a bit for me puzzling. Okay, so I stop here. Thank you very much again for the invitation, and thank you very much, Jose Luis, for your so interesting paper.
Jose Luis, perhaps you want to react to the comments? You have to unmute yourself.
I want. Well, many comments. I will try to answer the much as I can. First, regarding the concept of industrial equilibrium exchange rate. First of all, the question of natural deindustrialization is considered in the dynamic equation of the manufacturing share, where the autonomous component is assumed to be negative. Which means that even if the real exchange rate is at its industrial equilibrium level and the technological gap is 1, the economy will deindustrialize in the long run due to the natural forces of the industrialization observed in the developed countries. I'm not assuming that the technological gap is 1, or I'm not assuming that the domestic firms uses the same technology of foreign firms. This is a fundamental difference with my concept of industrial equilibrium exchange rate regarding to Bressa Pereira concept of industrial equilibrium exchange rate. Regarding the effects of exchange rate overvaluation, yes, the models show, but I can show my presentation, that the short-run effect of the exchange rate overvaluation is positive, mainly over consumption expenditures. But the question is that the long-term effect of all exchange rate overvaluation is negative, both over growth rate of real output and the manufacturing share. And regarding the what's the mechanism by which a reduction in the target inflation had these effects over manufacturing share and the growth rate of real output, because this is basically a Caldarian model. And when you reduce your inflation relative to the inflation of the rest of the world, so you increase your external competitiveness, and then you can increase your growth rate of exports. And since the source of autonomous demand growth in the model is exports, so you will increase the growth rate of real output. So I think that's the basic comments that I make with so little time.
Thanks very much. Perhaps we can collect some questions from the audience. If you can raise your hands in the Zoom. No questions? Yeah, Fabio Freitas, go on. Fabio?
Hi, Jose. I have one question, two questions. One is concerning the model, if there is an adjustment mechanism that brings the economy to the standard equilibrium.
Pardon? What?
An adjustment mechanism in the model that promotes the adjustment of the economy to the equilibrium level of the balance of payment. Or and also I would like if you could to clarify a little your investment autonomous investment adjustment.
Okay.
Please let me collect further questions. Fernando Toledo, yeah.
Thank you very much, Ariel. Congratulations for the presentation. It was very interesting indeed. I would like to ask you if you consider in your model the potential incidence of gross global capital flows that could induce some financial instability through the nominal exchange rate, particularly following some new innovations that post-Keynesian economics, such as Bonissi, Kaltenbrunner, Keller, and Botta, have recently shown about the importance of financial instability, Minskian concepts, and so on. So in your model, I think that you primarily focus your interest in real issues that was very, very attending indeed. But I would like to know if you think possible to consider also the dependence on the gross financial capital and particular push factors on your mechanism transmission that could take that could be important considering the exchange rate and the variable F that you explicit model. Thank you very much.
There is one more question from the audience. I think Alessandro Rasmi wants to ask.
I had several questions, but just quickly one question. Looking at the specification for capital flows, looks like the rate of growth of capital flows is a function of the interest rate differential, and I was puzzled by that, right? Because capital flows itself is a flow variable. So what that's assuming is that even if interest rates are the same as international interest rates, you still have continuous capital flows, even though they are not growing. So I was puzzled by the logic of that. But thanks for the presentation. I was curious about that specification.
Jose Luis, you can react to the questions if we will have collected enough,
yes.
At least this first round.
Yes, let us begin with Fabio Freitas. Fabio Freitas, thanks. Regarding the adjustment of the model, we still do not have time to make the stability of the short run and the balanced growth path without a structural change. we only have time to do the stability analysis of the balanced growth with structural change. And we are also want to do for the publication numerical simulation of the model. So then I think that the adjustment mechanism of the model will become clear. Well, regarding the autonomous component of investment demand, the idea is the same put by Lavoie in his article 2016. If the growth rate of output is higher than the growth rate of capital stock, this increases the animal spirits of capitalists because they are seeing their sales growing faster than the productive capacity, and then investment more. So you can say that it is a mechanism based on the supermultiplier. Well, it can be. I have no problems with that. My divergence with the Zarafian supermultiplier is not about this mechanism, but the source of autonomous demand growth. Well, regarding Fernando, yes, our concern on the paper was not about financial stability. We are basically worried about the long-term effects of monetary policy over the structural change of the economy and the growth path of real output. But in order to incorporate these relevant issues of financial stability, we have to specify a stock-flow consistent model, consistent with this theoretical framework. I am working with that with another colleague from the Federal University of Uberlândia, Julio Costa Santos, who is expert in modeling, in stock and flow consistent modeling. So I think that we can incorporate these relevant issues in the medium term. Regarding the Zran question about the specification, you see, if the model says that if the nominal domestic interest rate is equal to the international interest rate plus risk premium, the growth rate of capital flows is 0. And the growth rate of capital flows is in an increasing function of the difference between domestic interest rate and the international interest rate plus the country's premium, which I think is a very persuasive equation. The bigger is the differential equation, the bigger will be the capital inflows for the country for a given level of capital controls, and the higher will be the rate of exchange rate devaluation for a given level of intervention of monetary authorities in the exchange rate market. For me, it's a very reasonable specification. Well, if you had more deep criticism about this specification, you can send an email to me, and we can talk about that with more calm and in more technical terms. That's the answer that I have to give to you now.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis, again for your nice presentation. Thank you, Gabriel, for the comments. Now we can move then to the second presentation. The presenter is Fabio Freitas from the University of Rio de Janeiro. Fabio is professor of the University of Rio de Janeiro. He holds a PhD also from that university. He's also the director of the Institute of Economics at this university. He was president of the Brazilian Economic Association, director of the Brazilian Political Economy Society, and director of the Brazilian Keynesian Association. He has experience in economics with an emphasis on the analysis of economic growth and development, and his main fields of research are demand-led growth models, applied multi-sectoral input-output models and analysis, an analysis of economic development experience. He also works on a history of economic analysis. This is also a joint paper written with Fernando Ligeiro and Esther Dweck from the University of Rio de Janeiro, and the paper is called Autonomous Demand Composition and Fiscal Policy in a Supermultiplier Simulation Model. Fabio, when you want, the floor is yours.
First of all, I would like to thank German Feldman, Ariel Dvalskin, and Solange Suarez for the organization of the workshop and the invitation to discuss our work here. I will present a paper co-authored by Fernando Ligeiro and Esther Dweck. The paper is based on partial results extracted from Fernando's dissertation, supervised by Esther and me. And it deals specifically with the relationship between autonomous demand composition and fiscal policy performance within the analytical framework of a supermultiplier simulation model. Let me see, okay. I will start with the discussion of the main objectives and limits of the simulation exercise. Then I will discuss present the supermultiplier simulation model. After that, discuss the model calibration initial values, economic simulation scenarios and Salazar fiscal policy rule utilized in the simulation, and some simulation results, and finally, some concluding remarks. Let me start with the objectives and limits of the simulation exercise. The paper aims to analyze the influence of autonomous demand composition on the impact of fiscal policy and the effect of such impact on the economic performance of an economy. To do so, we will use a supermultiplier simulation model for we use a supermultiplier simulation model for a small open economy. We undertake a pure demand-led growth simulation exercise that ignores, for analytical purposes only, the possible repercussions to a demand-led growth pattern associated with the balance of payments and external imbalances, labor force employment dynamics, and also natural resources and environmental issues. We will not deal with these issues here, but we plan to address this in the future. Let me talk a little bit on the supermultiplier model. Let me start with the assumptions of the model. Concerning government activities, we suppose that they are limited to government consumption and investment, social transfers, direct taxation, and the issuing of debt denominated in domestic currency. Monetary authorities control the real interest rate through the manipulation of the nominal interest rate. Income distribution is exogenously determined, reflecting the influence of class conflict mediated by institutional and social framework. The only production method in use requires a fixed combination of homogeneous labor input and homogeneous fixed capital to produce a single product. Constant returns to scale prevail, and there is no technological progress to simplify the analysis. The model is specified in real terms, in the sense that all relevant variables of the model are real magnitudes and in discrete time framework. Regarding imports, we have imports of intermediary and final products as a function of the level of aggregate demand, as you can see by the equation, where where M is the import content coefficient. There is limited variable between 0 and 1. Aggregate consumption is divided into an induced component given by the post-tax wage bill, and an autonomous is, let me, the induced part of consumption is there is an autonomous component comprised by consumption out of social transfers and consumption financed by credit or accumulated wealth. Is the autonomous part of consumption. And omega is the wage share, and T subscript W is the tax rate on wage. Aggregate investment is also divided into an induced component given by business investment, and an autonomous component comprised by public investment, residential investment by households, and R&D, research and development expenditures by firms. Business investment follows the capital stock adjustment principle, and depends on the expected rate of growth of GDP and the level of output, the depreciation rate, and the normal capital output ratio. Growth expectations are formed according to the hypothesis of an adaptive expectations, according to the following difference equation, which is a type of adaptive expectations, where X is the expectation adjustment parameter, which is limited variable between 0 and 1. From the assumptions, we now deal with the basic equations of the model. First, the level of output of GDP is given by this equation, where the term embraces is the supermultiplier, incorporating both consumption, investment, inducement effects, and Z is the autonomous component of aggregate demand, comprising all variables discussed before, including exports, and exports that we not discussed. It's autonomous expenditure, and there is no difference between this Oreiro's supermultiplier and ours. In both, exports are an autonomous source of demand. This I don't understand his why he thinks that there is difference in this respect. There's a difference in this respect. The rate of growth of autonomous demand is the weighted average of the growth rates of its components, so that we have each of the autonomous demand components here, and I would like to emphasize this being a weighted average. We have here the weights for the government expanding, and in this these weights have as easy to follow. They have an important role in the model, because the effect of the growth rate of these autonomous components depends on the level or the value of these weights. The higher are these weights, the higher is the elasticity of autonomous demand growth to these components. So it's important to stress this point in the analysis of our results. There's a delay in the, sorry. There's a delay here. The rate of growth of GDP depends on the rate of growth of autonomous demand and on the change of the supermultiplier caused by the revisions of growth expectations that affect the propensity to invest according to the following difference equations. And there is one term for the growth of autonomous demand, and this term combines a pure term for the change in the supermultiplier with an interaction term that occurs with discrete time modeling, which combines the growth of autonomous demand with the change of the supermultiplier. Note that if other variables other than expected growth rate of GDP in the supermultiplier change, can be a distribution or the tax rate or the import content coefficient. In this case, there would be additional terms capturing these chains, which, however, are temporary and therefore capture level effects. Okay. Regarding the fiscal policy indicators, the primary surplus to GDP ratio is given by the following equation. Beta is the primary surplus. For its turn, the following difference equation. Note here that there is a part of the tax revenue which depends on interest income, and of course this is why we will have a different modification of the normal condition for the stability of the debt to GDP rate. For its turn, the following difference equation describes the dynamics of the debt to GDP ratio. So the part concerning regarding the primary surplus, and the part capturing the financial the debt services, and the financial dynamics of the total deficit. And here we have this coefficient is very important because it is directly related to the normal condition, which is transformed because of the tax rate on interest. And the normal condition holds when the growth rate of output is above the rate of interest multiplied by the complement of the tax rate on interest. And in this case, when the stability condition holds, it is possible to maintain a primary deficit to GDP ratio, excluding the interest tax revenues, without an increasing or decreasing debt to GDP ratio. Conversely, if the condition is not does not hold, a stationary debt to GDP rate requires the maintenance of a sufficiently high primary surplus to GDP ratio, which is the case that we will explore in the work. For model calibration, initial values, the calibration of the parameters and exogenous variables of the model, and the definition of the initial values for endogenous variables are chosen to reflect two different kinds of open economies. Country one, the government expenditure share in total autonomous demand is relatively high, and the economy is more inward oriented. Country two, the government expenditure share is relatively low, and the economy is more outward oriented. We use economic data from the Brazilian system of national accounts as our main source of information for the specification of the model, in particular for country one. The specification of the model for country two is used to establish the contrast with the country one case in order to allow for an evaluation of the role of autonomous demand composition. We have here in red, we have the differences between the two countries. For the import content coefficient, the country two has a higher coefficient. And also in terms of initial values, the tax rate are higher in country one than in country two. And we suppose that they are equal to each other to simplify the analysis. There is a parameter that allows us to consider different tax rates and modifications in their structure, in the tax structure. But we did not use this parameter or make it equal to 1 in this simulation. There is difference also regarding exports. In fact, since our output is supposed to be equal to 100 in the first period, this is the percentage. And so the country too has a high share or a higher share of exports in total output, and also in total autonomous demand. And country one have a higher share of government spending in transfers in total output and also in total autonomous demand. And here we have the share of, in the last line, we have the share of autonomous government expanding in total autonomous demand. Is the main difference between the two countries. We'll talk a little bit on about the economic simulation scenario and also about the stylized fiscal policy rule that we adopted in our simulation exercise. The scenario was set to reflect the example of a country in the periphery suffering a temporary shock that lasts for a few years, which initially affects exports and then leads to higher interest rates, negative growth rates for other autonomous private expenditures, and a change in the functional distribution that favors capital over labor. These variables go through market change that lasts for a few years, and after that, feature a recovery pattern. The behavior of the exogenously determined growth rates of exports, private autonomous demand components, the interest rate, and government share of autonomous demand is in the scenario are presented below. I will skip the table and just show the figure with the pattern of change of the growth rates of private autonomous demand. In blue, we have exports with a decrease in the first 3 periods, and then there is a recovery, and it's followed by other private autonomous demand components, residential investment, autonomous demand by firms, and autonomous consumption. Because there is a reaction to the external shock, which is increasing the interest rates that can affect the rate of growth of these autonomous demand, private autonomous demand components of the economy. And then they recover also and start growing at 2-3% at the end of the period. In our simulation exercise, we combined the economic scenario previously discussed with the assumption that the two types of economies that adopt the same fiscal policy rule, structural balance fiscal rule. More specifically, we suppose that in both economies, we have a primary structural surplus to GDP target ratio set at 2.5% of potential GDP, supposing that the initial primary balance is 1% and that it is supposed to be equal to the initial primary balance at potential output, potential GDP. There must be a fiscal adjustment involving 1.5% of GDP. The structural balance rule does not prescribe in which manner, by cutting spending or raising tax revenue, these adjustments must be conducted. For the specific simulation exercise conducted in the present article, we suppose the adjustment occurs with 2/3 of the adjustment through project expanding and 1/3 on raising revenue. So in the end, the 1.5 adjustment necessary to bring the economy to the target will be the spending cut will be responsible for 1% and then raising a tax revenue for 0.5%. Moreover, we assume that the expected growth rate of potential GDP follows the same simple rule like an adaptive expectations adopted to represent growth expectations in the specification of firms' fixed investment. When the primary structural surplus is equal or greater to the target level, Next period, government expanding grows at the rate of growth of potential GDP, and next period tax rates do not change. Let us see the simulation results. Country 1 has difficulties in achieving and maintaining the structural primary balance target of 2.5% of GDP throughout the whole period. The problem is that country 1 is subject to a perverse interaction between the growth of government expanding, GDP growth, and potential GDP growth, and structural balance, and the structural balance rule. As you can verify, the potential GDP growth rate is endogenous and it reacts to the growth rate, the actual growth rate of output by the adaptive expectation, creating a kind of a hysteresis in the growth rate of potential output. Because of the relatively high share of government expanding in total autonomous demand, the decline in government expanding growth has a great negative impact on the rate of growth of autonomous demand because of the weight of, as I showed before, the weights are high, and so the elasticity of autonomous demand growth to government expanding growth is very high. Moreover, due to the relationship between the trend rate of growth of observed GDP and the growth of potential GDP, the decline in government expanding growth also has a negative and lasting impact on the rate of growth of potential GDP. As a result of this interaction, we obtain first a decline in selling. The potential growth of GDP acts like a ceiling for the growth rate of government expanding. So it's a decline in selling for the rate of growth of government expanding, which creates a kind of reversed or inverted ratchet effect that leads to a declining trend of the growth rate of actual and potential GDP. An increasing debt to GDP ratio is also obtained, characterizing a situation of self-defeating austerity. Here we have the graphs. First, for the, I don't know why this is not the growth rates. In blue, we have the growth rate, expected growth rate, which is also the potential GDP growth rate. And in orange, we have the actual rate of growth of GDP. And the right graph here, we have the primary surplus balance, the structural primary surplus balance in orange, and the primary balance. And as you can see, the target is 2.5%, and it's achieved, but it's not maintained. And this is the source of the problems that leads to the self-defeating austerity scenario. And we have here the growth rate of government expanding, which is declining with a declining trend. And these peaks here, they are the points where the growth, where the target's achieved, but it's not maintained. Okay. And finally, we have the figure for the debt to GDP ratio, which increases initially and then stabilizes, and then it starts to increase again. And we will see it is a result of the differential between the rate of interest and the rate of growth of output.
Fabio, you have 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Stuck it here. Okay. The ratchet effect that I mentioned, and in orange we have the growth expected growth rate, which is a potential output growth rate, and in blue we have the growth rate of government expanding, and you can see that it touches when we have the targets achieved, but it's not maintained, and so there is a it functions like a ceiling for the growth rate of government expanding, imposing a kind of a reducing trend for this autonomous demand component, which is very has a huge impact on the growth rate of output, and also implies a declining trend for the growth rate of output. In contrast, country 2 subject to the same shock and using the same fiscal policy rule succeeds in achieving and maintaining the structural primary balance target of 2.5% of GDP after period 2 of our 20-period simulation. The initial decline in GDP growth after the shock is bigger than in country 1. This is the case because the shock involves a decrease in exports growth, and country 2 has a relatively high share of exports and also of private autonomous components, other private autonomous components in total autonomous demand. The later reduction is also reinforced by the decline in government expanding growth due to the operation of the fiscal policy rule. However, since country 2 succeeds in achieving and maintaining the structural primary balance target, government expanding growth is maintained at its same level given by the growth rate of potential GDP. And the later is reduced, the growth rate of potential GDP is reduced initially due to the negative impact of the temporary shock on the trend rate of growth of actual output. But after period 7, it starts to increase as the growth rate of private autonomous demand components recover from the initial negative shocks, beginning with exports and then also including the other domestic demand autonomous components, which eventually leads to a recovery in government expanding as well. Therefore, the ability to sustain and even increase the trend rate of growth of GDP explains why in country 2 there is no tendency towards a self-defeating austerity situation, with the debt to the GDP ratio declining after period 6. Here is the figures. The decline is bigger than in the case of country 1 for the growth rate of output. This is the potential output. You can see there is the growth rate at period 20 is greater than the initial level at 2.5. It's 3.0% here. And we have here the structural balances, the targets achieved in period 2, and it's above the target. The target is 2.5, and after that there is a decline in the structural primary balance, but it's above the target. And we have here the behavior of government expanding. It's a huge decline in the first period, but then it recovers, and in fact, it emulates the pattern of the growth rate of potential output. And finally, the figure for the graph for the debt to GDP ratio, which starts to increase, and then after period 7, it starts a declining trend until the last period of our simulation. Oh, let me put them. After the economic performances, after an initial period in which country 1 outperforms country 2 in terms of GDP, the situation is reversed until the end of the period of analysis. And throughout the whole period of our simulation exercise, country 2 GDP grows at an annual average rate of 2.4%, while country 1 GDP grows at an annual average rate of 0.8%. The reason for the difference in GDP performances is the relatively high share of the government expanding in the composition of autonomous demand, which in the end prevents the achievement and maintenance of the fiscal policy target. From the perverse interaction between growth of government expanding, GDP growth, potential GDP growth, and structural growth, it follows that we have a declining trend for the rate of growth of GDP, potential GDP, and also government expanding, and an increasing trend for the GDP, debt to GDP ratio. The difference of performance in terms of the debt to GDP ratio follows from the inability of country one to, in contrast to the ability of country two in achieving and maintaining sufficiently high primary surplus balance and primary surplus balances, and the bigger positive rate differential between the rate of interest and the GDP growth rate in country one due to its relatively poor performance in terms of GDP growth. This is the differential between the rate of interest and the rate of growth. In orange, we have country two, and in blue, country one. You can see the differences in market and are responsible for the dynamics of the debt to GDP ratio in there. Concluding remarks. Within our analytical framework, we show that autonomous demand composition is an important element in explaining the different economic and fiscal performances under the same fiscal policy rule and subjacent economic scenario. We suggested that in countries with a relatively high share of government expanding in total autonomous demand, the operation of fiscal policy rules can lead to low growth rates and self-defeat austerity, raising instead of lowering the debt to GDP ratio. In contrast, in countries with a relatively low autonomous demand share of government expanding, the operation of the same kind of fiscal policy rule can have a less perverse effect on GDP growth rates and better performance in terms of debt to GDP rating. We suggest the following topics for future research along the lines of the paper we developed. First, it is important to evaluate the robustness of our results with respect to different specifications of the model in terms of its parameters, initial conditions, particular specifications of the behavioral functions, and extensions based on stock and flow consistent framework. Alternative fiscal policy rules, which has already been addressed by Ligiero in his dissertation, and also different economic scenarios, which also has been addressed by Ligiero in his dissertation. It would be interesting to go beyond, the pure demand-led growth exercise done in this paper by explicitly incorporating the idea of balance of payment constraint along the lines suggested by the literature on Caldarian model, and considering the influences of external imbalances on aggregate demand growth, particularly through the economic policy channel. This explicit incorporation of labor market dynamics in the model and its repercussions on the aggregate demand growth, especially through its effects on income distribution, inflation, and the impact of these variables on economic policies. And finally, the explicit introduction of natural resources and environmental issues in the model, and the investigation of their repercussions on aggregate demand dynamics and economic policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fabio Freitas. Perfect score, perfect time. We can now move to the comments for the discussants. We have two discussants in this case. We can start with Florencia Medici from the University of Moreno and CONICET. Florencia.
Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the interesting presentation. I can't see Fabio in my screen. Ah, here. Hi. Well, I like your work. I enjoyed reading it. The paper opens many lines of research, such as the balance of payments, constraint growth, as you said. According to the analytical framework, the results on GDP of a negative demand shock and a contractionary fiscal policy are those we expected, especially in economies where domestic demand, being private or governmental, is a central driver of growth. One of the main contributions of the paper is giving us analytical tools to design the economic policy, taking into account different structural configuration, also not only autonomous, the composition of the autonomous demands. So I'll take the opportunity to briefly discuss these results, taking into account the Argentinian economy as a mix between country one and country two, especially thinking that country one is I using in Brazil with the Brazil parameters. Latin American countries in general and Argentina in particular need to increase the domestic demand in order to reduce the poverty and unemployment, which become much worse because of the pandemic. Without considering the balance of payments, we know that the economic policy is constrained by the requirement of the external financial markets, and this requirement implies, in general, government expenditure reduction. So Argentina is characterized by a relative high debt in external debt indebtedness, a relative high primary sector, and Argentina propensity to import is high it's around 30%. So while I was reading, I was thinking in a mixed case. According to your definition, Argentina, with these characteristics, will be an outwards-oriented economy because of the propensity to export, but Argentina has a relatively large government share in the total autonomous demand, or at least Argentina has a relative poor export dynamics. So it's in this case, it will be an inwards-oriented economy, but so taking into account these characteristics, the model helps us to understand that the public finance sustainability growth is not possible in the current context. So I can picture the results on growth of a primary surplus target will be even worse than you simulated for the country one, for both scenarios. So I would like to know your point of view about this case. And this is my main, question or comments. And before finishing, I have a tiny question about the calibration. Are the figures of the functional income distribution missing, or there is a little mistake in the appendix? Because I was yes, the last column is
the last column is the wage share.
Okay, now I was pretty sure, but I
yes
confirm. But thank you for the paper and the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Perhaps Lucas Teixeira now is the second discussant from the State University of Campinas. He can give his comment, and then Fabio can reply to all of, to both.
Thank you, Ariel. Good afternoon to everybody. I'd like first to thank Herman Feldman and Ariel Devonsky and Solange Soares for organizing the workshop and for the invitation to participate and comment on Professor Fabio Freitas' paper. It's an honor to participate at this workshop. Well, the central issue of Professor Freitas' paper is to build a simulation model based on the Schrafian supermultiplier growth model in order to evaluate a fiscal policy rule in two economies: the Brazilian economy, that's an inward-oriented economy, and a kind of Brazilian economy if it was export-led. This evaluation, as we just saw, is made under the assumption of a negative shock that begins with a reduction of exports, then goes on an increase of the interest rates, and the reduction of private domestic expenditures. And the results are quite interesting. The fiscal policy follows a structural balance rule, and it's said that this kind of rule should be neutral to the business cycle, since it aims to adjust fiscal balance to the potential GDP and not the actual GDP. And also do it slowly. You don't have to achieve the target in only one period. But the main result is that in an economy with a big public sector, this fiscal rule has a contractionary effect on the economy. It intensifies the downturn and penalizes the economic recovery. because the recession has a negative effect on the rate of growth of potential GDP, and it has a negative effect on the rate of growth of public expenditures. As exports present a relatively small share of total autonomous expenditures, when it recovers, it cannot lead economic growth. The overall performance of these economies worse than the export-led one, and the smaller rate of growth of with a smaller rate of growth of GDP and a bigger debt to GDP ratio. The fiscal rule could not attenuate its impact on the business cycle, and it presents a case of self-defeating austerity. This sends us two straightforward messages. The first one is this rule doesn't work properly in all cases. And if it's a bad rule, it does less damage to the economy where the public sector is smaller. So a few comments to Fabio. First, why to simulate this particular fiscal rule? Brazil has 3 fiscal rules right now: a target for the primary balance, a ceiling for primary expenditures, and a golden rule. But the one you simulate is not as none of the 3 we have in Brazil. And I wonder, as Florencia Medici said, how this economy of your model would behave under other fiscal rules, because usually we tend to think that a simple primary budget rule would be even more pro-cyclical. And I wonder if it's really the case in your model. Some comments about your model strategy. The first one is why you did not choose some initial conditions that would represent a steady state. In the starting scenario, the debt to GDP ratio is not constant. It has a downturn tendency. And besides that, and nevertheless, the initial primary balance is smaller than the target. It's 1% of GDP, and the target is 2.5% of GDP. So this initial condition puts a downward pressure to both economies, but it's strongest in the more inward-oriented one. So even in the absence of a negative shock on exports, the first economy would present a worse economic performance. So how much of your results could be attributed to the initial values instead of the reaction of the fiscal policy rule to the negative temporary shock? A few comments about the shock design of the paper. I understand that maybe it was chosen, you had chosen this shock to simulate a traditional shock that Brazilian economy has experienced, and also Latin American economies in general have experienced. A negative external shock followed by a negative domestic shock caused by a hike on domestic interest rate. But I wonder if it was the best strategy to evaluate the structural balance rule. Both economies have the same size of domestic private expenditures and differ only by the size of public expenditures and exports. So as the leading expenditure of your shock is the exports, they start they start with a severe decline, then recover to a rate of growth bigger than the initial condition. If we look to the export-led growth economy, by definition, exports are a bigger share of GDP and of total autonomous expenditures. So an increase of the same amount on the rate of growth of exports applied to both economies will have different results. The export-led one will grow faster than the inward-oriented one. In this sense, the exogenous determined rate of growth of exports, that is your temporary shock, would make the inward economy performs poorly than the export-led one, even if public expenditures would grow at a constant rate. So I wonder if the best test, the fiscal policy rule, would be a shock on the domestic private sector, because it has the same size in both economies. So final comment, as you say in the paper and in your presentation, it would be really interesting to have some extensions of this simulation model, in particular to deal with the balance of payment constraints. Even your shock is designed, I believe, to replicate these external shocks to Latin American economies that in general they may experiment. That is a reduction of exports, that is a reduction of strong currency inflows, and a hike of interest rates trying to attract capital flows. In this scenario, this other scenario, the relevant debt would be the external debt. This is the one that Latin American countries sometimes in their history fail to pay. And the internal debt GDP ratio in general is of minor interest, or at least it should be, because as we know, any country can pay any amount of debt if it's denominated in its own currency. So thank you again for the invitation and the opportunity to comment on this paper.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Florencia, Fabio, perhaps you want to react?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank Florencia and Lucas for their comments. And start with Florencia. We have the discussion of Argentina, and we used the model to analyze the Brazilian economy, but when we've done the contrast, we tried to make the Brazilian economy different in order to evaluate the hypothesis of the influence of autonomous demand composition. So it's not really, the country too is not really Argentina, but has aspects of Argentinian economy, as you told us here. So I believe that autonomous demand composition, and this is a point where I disagree with a little bit with Oreiro, and because different economies may have different sources of autonomous demand as their main drive. So I'm not closer to the idea that some economies are driven by exports, and not even that in the long run, with the problem of balance of payment constraints, exports are a strategic variable, even in economies in which are more inward oriented. So it's a false disagreement that is trying to push. I mean, we both use a supermultiplier model nowadays, and concerning Argentina, I believe that the point is that if you use other rules than the structural balance, the result is the same. It's also a response to Lucas here. We in Fernando's dissertation, we studied alternative fiscal policy rules, the simple primary surplus balance, which as Lucas rightly thought is more introduce more instability in the system and has also a poor performance, and a primary surplus balance combined with a government expenditure ceiling, which is the worst one, which is near our, as Lucas asked, our situation in Brazil, which has also the golden rule. Besides these two combined rules, there is also the golden rule, and a structural primary surplus combined with an escape clause for zero bound interest floor and a special treatment for government investment, which is kind of post-2008 fiscal policy rule. And we also evaluated a different kind of rule, which is not, I believe, used anywhere, which is a kind of effective demand rule, which use the growth of exports as a reference, and the external debt constraint as a reference for the fiscal policy, decisions. So the three traditional, besides the structural balance that we presented here, has the same result. The same result is obtained. The composition of demand affects between different countries with different compositions of autonomous demand, has different results, the same kind of results that we obtained with the structural balance rule. So it's robust with respect to these different specifications for the fiscal policy rule. And in fact, the motive, because the reason why in the end we develop an alternative fiscal policy rule to the effective demand rule was inspired by the problems of balance of payments, which are for us the real problem in Latin American countries because of the mismatch of our currency and the fact that we cannot pay our debts or our external obligations with our own currency. So in the end, I think that this fourth rule, the effective demand rule, can be useful in the discussion of Argentinian case because it combines the fiscal policy rule with the dynamics of exports. It's also important for the Brazilian economy. We cannot grow at a higher rate than exports for long periods without creating problems for our balance of payments in terms of external debt. So it's really a constraint on the growth rate. And there is a recent work by myself and Franklin Serrano and Gustavo Berg, which deals with these issues of the constraint given by the external debt in the review of Keynesian economics, which exactly we obtained the same kind of fuel law, even in the case in which we have, in terms of growth, even in the case in which we have capital flows. It's the same constraint, okay? So this is inspiration for the effective demand rule that we developed in the dissertation, but not here. I don't know, Florencia, if I deal with what we wanted. I answered your question or not, because since I'm not an expert in Argentine economy, I'm a little bit, I don't know if I can say something more about it. It's muted.
No, thanks.
And thank you very much. Regarding Lucas' questions, first, there is the fiscal rules that I already addressed. We simulated 5 different fiscal policy rules, and also different mix of adjustment by government expanding, also tax expanding or tax, and the weight of each kind of adjustment is, we analyze the difference when the adjustment is made in terms of raising tax more than cutting expanding. And also the initial conditions, we made a choice. We used the Brazilian economy as our inspiration. And of course, there are some variables which is not the one observed in the Brazilian economy. And you talked about one of them, which is the primary surplus, which is set to 1% of GDP or potential GDP at the first period, and the target, which is. But we wanted to create a stress test for the model. This is why we used the 2.5% GDP target for the structural balance, starting with a 1% balance. In terms of the shock design, we simulated other scenarios also. We simulated a scenario of an export boom scenario, an international and local financial crisis scenario, and also a normal cycle pattern scenario for central countries. The results are also similar in terms of the role of autonomous demand composition. So it's robust with respect to the alternative fiscal policies, also with respect to alternative scenarios evaluated. And your suggestion that we use private autonomous demand as a reference can be. We can use this suggestion to make a simulation and evaluate if it's a better way to express our results. But I believe that the fact that we use the same policy rule and the same scenario, economic scenario, makes the point. We have only one difference between the two economies, and this difference makes the results different. So it's and this is robust in terms of the scenario and the policy rules. Although we not showed this part in the paper. Okay. It's okay, Lucas? Ariel.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, thank you very much for the comments and for the presentation. We don't have time to collect questions now from the audience, but if you want, you can send it to us, and we will manage to send the questions to Fabio Freitas. So we move to the last presentation of the day. Will be done by Gabriel Michelena, who works at the Central Bank. Gabriel holds a master's in econometrics from the University Torquato di Tella, and he's currently finishing his PhD dissertation applied to the study of balance of payment shocks. He has been working in different positions in the government sector of his country, always devoted to the elaboration of mathematical and statistical models for the assessment of public policies. Additionally, he has published several articles in different scientific journals and book chapters. And as I said, he's currently working as an advisor to the board of the Central Bank of Argentina in modeling and macroeconomic financial issues. The name of the paper is an empirical stock-flow consistent macroeconomic model for Argentina. Gabriel, when you want, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ariel, for the introduction. I will start sharing the presentation. Thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be presenting at this seminar on such interesting topic as economic modeling. Very useful to think the economic policy agenda in the following years in Argentina. Thanks, Ariel. Thanks, Herman, for the invitation. Well, let's start. My presentation today will be focused on the empirical stock-flow consistent macroeconomic model, specifically an empirical model for Argentina, for the Argentinian economy. My presentation is split in 4 different elements, 4 different points that I want to highlight along the presentation. In the first one, I'm going to make a brief introduction to the stock flow models, what they really are, for what they work. Then I will make a description of the main features of the stock flow consistent model for Argentina. And in the third point, I will put forward the scenarios, and we will make the model sync with simulations. And then we will analyze the results, the main findings. And finally, I will finish the presentation with the concluding remarks, trying to summarize the main findings. And I will talk also a little bit about the limitations, how they can be used in order to think the ongoing agenda. Well, let's make a brief introduction to the stock flow models for the broad public that probably do not know the specificities. Well, there are 5 main features that every stock flow model have and share. The first one is the horizontal consistency, which refers to the relation between debtors and creditors and the flows. A payment for a sector also must be recorded as income for another. There's also the vertical consistency, which means or refers to the budget constraint that every institutional sector faces in the economy. Then we have the stock flow consistency. This is a valuation property. The valuation of stock at the end of period is always equals the value of stock at the beginning of the periods plus the flows and plus or minus the capital gains. For instance, for a foreign denominated asset or liability, the capital gains are always strongly related to the appreciation or depreciation of the exchange rate during the period. The property number 4 is the balance sheet consistency, which is similar to the first one, but now it implies the relation between debtor and creditors, but with respect to the stocks. An asset for institutional sectors also is always recorded as a liability for other sectors. And finally, I think this is very relevant to mention, is the feedback effect between flows and stocks. Stocks are not only included or exclusively included in the model for an accounting purpose, but they include also because they generate flows in the economy, flows of incomes and payments, and then eventually has an impact on saving decision and investment decision across the different sectors that finally feedback in the stock themselves. Well, a little bit of history about the stock flow models. In the same way that every social accounting based model, the mother of all of this model is the input-output of Wassily Leontiev, is the Anand and Eva. Then we have in the 1950, the Cambridge project of Richard Stone and his collaborating team. They were devoted to the combination. They were looking for and trying to combine the national accounts with the input-output model. From that project, the social account matrix was the most relevant outcome, the more relevant product. Also from that project, there emerged a lot of very interesting distributions in the subsequent decades. The most relevant in the model family is the new Cambridge model, in which Wayne Godley played a very important role. There is a very relevant and interesting paper in the 1976 of Godley and Cripps, which we can consider today as the most similar toy model to the current stock flow models. And during the 80s and the 90s, we have a lot of contributions that finally have synthesis in the stock flow model book of Lavoie and Godley in 2007. In this book, The Monetary Economics, Lavoie and Godley finally came out with a synthesis and with a clean framework explaining to the community, especially to the post-Keynesian economists, what it really is in an order and a very consistent way. Well, how this sort of model are implemented? Well, the work usually starts for the data collection, collecting the data. We have data for many sources, national accounts, financial transactions, labor market, tax collection, and many other satellite accounts that are relevant. We need to combine this information, merge it, and finally adjust this in order to achieve the consistency. This consistency is assured by the social accounting matrix framework. And when we have all this information adjusted and ready, we are ready to move to the model wheel itself. Here is where the theory comes into play. In the case of the stock flow models, the the main theoretical framework came from post-Keynesian economics and also from the structuralist economics. This theoretical school of thought influencing the sort of the functional forms and behavioral equation we will put in the model. So when we have complete the model, we have to specify the exogenous elasticities. Usually when the information is available, something that is not always true or possible for developing countries with statistical deficiency, especially with respect to the countries, to the advanced countries. These elasticities, when possible, as I say, can be potentially estimated using, well, the econometrics, traditional time series models, or even cross-section or panel data models. So now we have the three main components of Stock-Flujo model: the social account matrix, the data, the main database, the functional forms, the model with all its structure, and the exogenous parameters. So we need to combine all this information and try to reproduce the model, make the model run. And if the model can reproduce correctly the data in the base year, then we can be sure that the model is working properly and it lacks of any errors. So we can move to the simulations. Well, usually simulation always start by the questions that the policymaker has. What happens if we push the public expenditure, if we want to increase spending in infrastructure, can be also changes in taxes. Whatever policy variable that is in control of the institution, obviously, as can be a shock on the interest rate and on other financial variables or parameters. Well, in this regard, we obtained using the model these counterfactual scenarios, these new scenarios. We can make a policy evaluation using the information provided by the model. The numeric results are useful to think the policies in terms of cost and benefits. If you know are more questions, then the work with the model can be considered complete and we can exit and move to the next thing. Well, what about the immersion of the Stock-Flujo empirical models? As I said before, the Stock-Flujo models exploded after the publishing of the Law and Goldie masterpiece in 2007, which is the most influential book in this literature. But the empirical models, appear more late in the time. We had to wait till 2013 to see the first empirical contributions. These first empirical contributions were published at the Levy Institute for Bar College. There were two models, one for the United States and other for Greece, both written by Papadimitriou, Cesa, and Nikiforos. And then we have in 2017, a very relevant contribution in this literature, because the Bank of England published and adopted officially a Stock-Flujo model written by Godin, Burgess, and other, a big team, a big number of contributors participated of this project, but the main model was published that year and was officially adopted by a very relevant institution in the world, so it generated a huge impact in the community. Well, then we have other contributions, more recent in time. in 2017, also I published here in Argentina a previous version of the current model, along with Nahuel Guaita. It doesn't create the same success and impact of the Bank of England model, but was equally relevant. We have models in 2020 that were published for Denmark, Italy, and Argentina. The last one was written by Sebastián Valdecanto. He will be commenting this presentation, this work after me. He's one of the most relevant, I would say, model creators, Stock-Flujo model creators in the region and in the world. So his contribution is very relevant. Well, what about the model for Argentina? We will start diving in the particularities, the features of the model that I have set up for Argentina. Well, I will start with the challenge. I think it's very interesting to discuss what are the issues that the modelers usually face in developing countries when need to try to work with empirical models. The first problem or the first issue is that data is usually incomplete. There are quality issues in some cases that are relevant. For example, lack or very outdated input-output matrix, and so on. The second problem I want to mention is the difficulty or the problem to select a stable year to construct the social account matrix. As you know, the Argentinian economy has suffered many drastic and external crises during the last years, and it affected the structure of the economy, probably not the productive structure in a big extent, but it affected the savings ratios, evenly the saving accounts. For instance, in 2018, the current account deficit was almost 6% of the GDP. In 2019, was close to the equilibrium. Well, that happened when the economy is in the in ongoing dynamic of adjustment. For the same reason, it's also hard to evaluate the stocks across time. And also the flows, because it's hard to understand exactly and to measure exactly in which extent the changes in the value of stocks in two different moments of time are the result of a real change, for instance, of new issue or issuing of new debt, or just a change in the valuation because, well, that stock was valuated in foreign exchange, and the economy suffered a big devaluation. For instance, in Argentina, the official devaluation in 2018 was close to 100%. That had a huge impact in stock valuations in the economy. Well, and finally, and I think this is also very relevant, the inflation is high in our economy. So this is not an issue for all the European and the US model, as I mentioned before. They don't, in some cases, they don't even model the inflation. They don't have equation for inflation because not an issue for them. But in our economy, inflation is an issue, and we cannot set it out of the model. It creates also some, in my opinion, some stability problems, but also multiply several times the amount of equation we need to introduce. So for that reason, at the end, I was getting a bigger model that I wish at the beginning. Well, this is the final version of the model, and it's the summary. You have all the three blocks or components that are very relevant: the social account matrix, the elasticities, and the model itself. There are 97 equations. is I only want to say that I don't have the Guinness record. Sebastian has bigger models than me, so this model is not the biggest one. The model obviously has also the same amount of endogenous variables, but also almost 80 exogenous variables and parameters. So you can, realize or get an idea that how big the model is. Well, I'm going to talk about the main features of the model. I include finally some equations. I don't want to get deeper with the equations because I think the grid doesn't provide much information. I will make it probably a shallow review, but I want to mention the main feature and I want to spend some time on it. First of all, as I said before, the Stock-Flujo models, and this is not the exception, is strongly influenced by the post-Keynesian economics, in which aggregated demand plays a fundamental role. This is a very relevant difference with respect to other models, other empirical models, especially the DSGE approach that was presented yesterday. I'm not saying that this is a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying that it's different. In our model, the main driver of growth are the exogenous push or impulse in government spending and also in the exogenous growth of our trade, the exports. Well, the government equations are very well detailed. I model 7 different taxes. I differentiate also between capital and government spending. There is one representative household that consumes, saves, and invests, always financially speaking. The household here has to make their portfolio choice. Inflation is driven mainly for the cost push dynamic and conflict claims between union and firms. I'm taking here the traditional approach in the price dynamic into the post-Keynesian and structurally economic. Well, finally, private investment vary according to the accelerator principle, and also I include the crowding in effect of public investment in line with the empirical literature and the last empirical finding got for Argentina for some papers. There were one relevant lately of Izquierdo et al., which found empirical evidence of a significant effect of public investment in the Argentinian province on private investment. Well, I think the equations just reproduce what I said before, so I will pass them. I will not spend time here. I will talk a little bit about the financial side of the economy that probably represent one of the main contributions of this work. As you know, the balance sheet provides us with the an accountability of the main liabilities and assets that every sector has. So I will talk a little bit about that. I will mention the financial instruments that every sector can have in their balance sheet. In the case of the government spend and invest, and also can finance their saving with taking loans from the central bank or taking loans from the domestic or commercial banks, or even from the rest of the world. The central bank can also provide loans to the government, has foreign reserves in its assets, and provide with cash in circulation to households. Also require reserves to the commercial banks, and finally provide and issue its own bills. In the case of the firms finance the investment decisions, taking loans from domestic commercial banks and also from foreign loans from the rest of the world. Finally, commercial banks provide loans to government and firms, can acquire central bank milks, have to comply with the reserve requirements, and take deposits from government and households. And yes, finally, the households have to make the famous portfolio choice and need to allocate their financial wealth in domestic deposit, foreign deposit, and cash in circulation. Well, let's move to the simulations. I will talk a little bit about the base scenario. The base scenario always try to provide a baseline in order to analyze alternative scenarios. It try to be the consensus scenario or try to reproduce the consensus scenario. Well, in the baseline, I assume that government increased spending, investment, and transfer in the period 2020-2021 as a result of the anti-COVID package and stimulus package to counter the recessive and negative effect of the pandemic. And afterwards, it let it constant in real terms. The financing is carried out by issuing debt in the local market. It tries to reflect the current situation in Argentina, in which the international finances doesn't look possible or close. It also takes on loans for the central bank, although progressively reduces expositions to central banks.
Sorry, you have 10 minutes.
Oh, thank you. Okay, we are good. We also incorporate the restructuring of the public debt, which relax the interest payment to the rest of the world in the following years. And last but not least, I will talk a little bit about external closure because it's very relevant for the model. I also here try to reproduce or recreate the current exchange rate regime in Argentina. So I set a fixed exchange rate with a crawling peg rule for the official rate, which regulate or has an impact mainly on the trade balance account. And also I create or I introduce a different exchange rate, a free market exchange rate without the control of central bank for the financial operations for the capital account. So we have the exchange rate market split in two. In the official one, the central bank can control the exchange rate, and this exchange rate affect the trade balance, mainly export and import. And on the other hand, there is a free market exchange rate that need to adjust freely in order to equilibrate the supply and demand mainly from households, but also from firms and so on. Well, let's move to the scenarios. The alternative scenarios try to create some deviation for the baseline that can be useful to think or to discuss the policy agenda. Firstly, I introduce a fiscal discipline scenario, which is similar to the base scenario, but the main difference is that the government cuts the spending in order to achieve a fiscal deficit of less of 1% in 2020. So there is a goal for government, and the goal is to reduce the government. Then we have two expansive scenarios, one with public investment playing an important role. The government in this scenario tried to achieve 3% of public investment with respect of the GDP as a goal. This is the historical, I would say, a mean level for Argentina that has dropped in the last year during the adjustment, especially in 2018 and 2019. And finally, we have a super expansive scenario with cash transfers from government to household, large and sustainable with respect to the previous periods in order to boost recovery. So I want, with those alternative scenarios, I want to measure in which extent or what are the main economic effects for the government to deviate for this baseline scenario, one with an expansive alternative, another with a more contractive hawkish. Well, I split the results in three main blocks. Obviously, I don't have here time or the space to provide with all the detailed results that a model can generate, but I will focus in the most relevant for the discussion, and I think for the current economic debate here in Argentina. The first one of these blocks refers to the economic activity, strongly related to the GDP growth rate and to the unemployment rate. In all cases, we can see a strong recovery. Something I forgot to mention was that also I'm modeling an exogenous and autonomous recovery in 2021, both in export and in private consumption, as a result of the normalization of the negative effect of the pandemic. As you know, during 2020, especially households weren't able to consume, especially services, but there was a big jump in, for instance, in the saving ratio households, and it had a negative impact on consumption. So we are expecting from 21 and ongoing a normalization of these effects that will impact positively, as we are seeing now into these months, on consumption and also on exports. Well, so all the scenarios estimate a relevant and meaningful economic recovery in 2021, with a trajectory moving to a more normal GDP growth rate in the subsequent years. In the case of the adjustment scenario, in which the government seek with determination the fiscal consolidation and discipline, this growth is delayed, and we can see on the graph on the right, it has a negative impact on the unemployment rate in the first years of the simulations. In the expansive scenario, the drop in unemployment is meaningful and is at a faster rate than in the other scenarios. So we have here four scenarios. From the growth perspective, obviously, the most relevant is the expansive, because it can boost activity and absorb the unemployment in the economy. But let's move to the public finance, sorry, to the public finance, and see what happened here. Well, here we are seeing clearly the first conflict between the need to improve the fiscal account and bring debt to more sustainable levels, with the need to boost growth and accelerate the recovery and to reduce unemployment. Except for the expansionary case, in the rest of the scenario, the deficit gradually decrease, converging to or closer to a 2% of GDP by the year 2027. Obviously in the adjustment scenario, the equilibrium is achieved very early. Also, in all cases, we can observe a gradual decline in the ratio of debt to GDP. In the case of the adjustment scenario, this reduction is more significant, more quicker, and also the decline is faster. On the other hand, in the expansive scenario, we are not seeing, because of the estimation window we have selected, we are not seeing the negative effects or the impact of the interest on debt, well, in a clear way. Obviously, if the estimation window will be wider, we could have seen this effect more easily. Well, I haven't mentioned, and I'm not depicting it here, but I'm not showing the foreign exchange debt of the government here. I'm not depicting it, but in all cases, I can say that it decreases. This is also the result of two effects. The first one is that we are considering that the government do not have access to to international financial markets, and because the government is not devaluating or not making exchange rate shocks that can make or create a jump in the foreign debt. Well, finally,
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, I'm muy quick. Well, finally, we have the external sector results. I have not much time to talk about it, but I want to mention here that there is the second conflict that appears evident in the economy between the needs of boost recovery on reduced unemployment and with the external constraint that the economy faces. In all the cases, we can see that the current account surplus diminish progressively in the subsequent years. In the expansive scenario, the economy very quickly consume all the original surplus and is moving forward to a dangerous zone in which the current account deficit is very, very high. It doesn't happen, obviously, in the adjustment scenario, in which the decline is less faster, is more progressive, but the tendency is equally downwards. This is a result mainly in the model of the Argentina dependence on imports. Almost all the estimation for Argentina estimate the import income elasticity in a value around 3. So when the economic activity react strongly to public spending and to external issues, the imports usually grow faster and consume a lot of dollars that are available. Well, I'm finishing the presentation with the concluding remarks. Well, the first point that I want to highlight is that stock-flow models are very powerful tool to make prediction in the medium run, not probably in the short run, or well, in the long run, we have to make some heroic assumptions in order to be confident of the result, obviously, but they are good providing results in the medium run. They also allow us to estimate consistently stock and flow for the main institutional sectors of the economy. The results for the economy of Argentina and the different scenario shows a conflict that is very relevant for the economic policy between the fiscal push required to reduce unemployment and to push the recovery, and with external gap faces by an economy without access to the international financial markets. It also provides a forecast for the government debt stocks, households, and other financial variables, and this is one of the main features of the model, the inclusion of a financial and formalization of the financial sector, and the provision and estimation of numerical results. Well, I move more quickly now to end the presentation with a limitation. Well, data quality is far from perfect. You know the famous phrase, garbage in, garbage out. If the data is not good enough, the result will not be good, the quality will not be good enough. This Stock-Flujo model is big. It has almost 100 equations, almost 80 exogenous parameters, so it's subject to the Lucas critique. The last two are more a signal of warning. The third limitation is large model make it difficult to trace causality and transmission channel. In the extreme of complexity of Asian maze model, causality is really hard to trace. And even if we trust in the model or even in the economic theory, we can lose ourselves very easily. We can easily start to telling false stories that are not happening. The problem is that the complexity of the model is really hard to track, it's really hard to understand. Also, I will say that all these models, I think it applies not only to a Stock-Flujo model, but also almost to every model, are good to analyze shocks, are good to analyze some regular baseline scenarios to provide forecasts for normal times. But when the shocks we want to simulate or the scenarios we want to simulate are more extreme, well, probably these models are not good to provide us with relevant information and to provide the result that can be useful to understand the implication of the shock. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ariel, for the extra time.
Thank you, Gabriel, for the nice presentation. Now we can move to the comments by Sebastián Valdecantos from the University of San Martin. Gabriel, you should stop sharing.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much, Germán, Ariel, and Solange for the invitation and the organization. And thank you, Gabriel, for this very interesting presentation. I'll try to be brief because I guess that most of you are hungry by now. So one general comment I want to make is that it is good news that the Central Bank of Argentina is widening its mind and showing openness to non-conventional modeling approaches, which have proven to provide good insights to key macroeconomic questions in other countries. This is something that is happening elsewhere. Here I'm giving you some examples of international organizations that are currently being interested in stock-flow consistent modeling. So it's good news that the Central Bank of Argentina is along the same lines. About the paper, I must highlight the big effort that Gabriel has made to build the social accounting matrix for Argentina. For those who are not familiarized with this methodology, it is important for you to know that the cornerstone of this modeling technique, as well as for computable general equilibrium models, is the social accounting matrix. And unfortunately, in Argentina, we don't have a fully integrated and consistent system of accounts, which means that a researcher that wants to build either a CGE model or an SFC model has to build the social accounting matrix himself. So I think that Gabriel did a very good work in the collection of different data sources in order to make it consistent and build a social accounting matrix for the year 2018. So this is something that must be underlined, I think. Another interesting thing of the presentation and the paper is the possibility of having different closures for the model, in particular for the external sector. And this is something important because it shows the flexibility that this modeling technique has to design different institutional and economic policy settings. And this is of particular importance, I think, for policymakers who want to test and simulate for different alternatives that they can have. And I think that Gabriel makes good use of this feature of SFC models, and maybe it's not so clear in the presentation, but if you read the paper, you will see that there are different clear closures for the external sector of Argentina. And from my point of view, the most salient feature, the strongest point of this paper is the modeling of the financial sector of the economy. As you may recall, yesterday during the presentation of Mariana from the Central Bank of Chile, one of the comments that were made is that one of the shortcomings of DSGE models is the very simplistic way of modeling the financial sector of the economy. And if you look at Gabriel's paper, and it is also clear in the presentation, the modeling of the financial sector of Argentina is very clear and detailed. We have several financial assets, we have behavioral equations, we have endogenous interest rates. And this is something that must be stressed because I think that in a financialized world, it is important that models account for the importance of the financial sector of the economy. And this is something that is present in Gabriel's work. A few questions I have. The most technical ones, I already sent them to Gabriel. He didn't say anything in the presentation about the Taylor rule, but in the paper, he describes an augmented Taylor rule. My question is about the parameters. Are the parameters of the Taylor rule taking into account the different approaches to monetary policy that were present in Argentina during the time frame, or are they constant over the time frame? Because it is clear that the approach to monetary policy in Argentina was different in 2018 than in 2021 now. So the question is if those parameters are constant or if the Taylor rule is accounting for this regime shift that come with changes in the government. Another question I have concerns firms' profits. If I understood correctly, you are modeling firms' profits as a fixed share of production. And I wonder if there isn't another way of modeling profits, because I think that in Argentina, at least, firms' profits in the short run are influenced by a several range of factors like the taxation, exchange rate shocks, the prices of utilities. So in case I understood correctly and firms' profits are modeled as a fixed share of production, I wonder why you chose to take that path. And I would also like you to say some few words about the econometric techniques that you used, because as I was telling you in our email exchanges, you didn't say anything about that in the paper. And I think it's important that if we are talking about an empirical paper, to know something about the estimations that were carried out. And finally, some suggestions for improvement. It is my opinion that when we work with models that are aimed at making forecasts or policy analysis, well, it is better to work with quarterly data instead of yearly data, and to limit the simulations to a shorter time horizon, because for instance, in your paper, your simulations go up to the year 2030. In the presentations, we saw simulations that go up to 2027. And honestly, I think that, we are unable to say anything about what's going to happen or what the world will be like in 5 years' time or 7 or 10 years' time. So I think that if we work with quarterly data, we get the possibility of constraining our simulations to the short to the medium term, that is to say 2-3 years at most. And that first, it can give us more insight into the specificities of the short and the medium run. And on the other hand, it relieves us from making assumptions about how the world will be like in 2025, 27, or 2030, which is really uncertain, I think. And the second thing I would like to say concerns the validation of the model. I think that in order to make forecasts or policy analysis, we need to have a valid model. And not from the presentation, but from the paper, I think that there are some variables that don't seem to track the trajectory, the actual trajectory of the same variable in the case of the Argentinian economy, mainly the rate of inflation. You said something in the presentation, but I think that maybe more work needs to be done in order to get a rate of inflation and other variables that resemble more the way they are currently behaving in Argentina. So those are the comments I have to Gabriel's paper. I want to congratulate him for his work. I know it's an ongoing process. I think it's going on the right way. And it's really good to see that at the central bank, he's getting the support that he needs to deepen on this methodological approach. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the comments. Gabriel, perhaps you want to react on them?
Thank you, Sebastian, for the comments, for the insight to recommendations. I'm going to be brief in order to let the people go to take a break. Well, yes, with respect to the interest rate policy rule, if you work with, you try to make econometric estimation, you will realize very quickly that there are a lot of structural breaks. There are different regimes during the last years, last decades. So I think if you are going to make an econometric estimation of the parameters, you are forced to do it carefully in order to identify the regimes, in order, well, to select the estimation windows. On the other hand, those parameters can also be manipulated in order to create different a different approach from the central banks. So the question would be, is the central bank more concerned with inflation or with the exchange rate stability or with the unemployment, for instance? So we can have different results, well, playing with those parameters, independently of what the econometric can tell us or can provide us. With respect to the profit, I do agree. In your versions, I try to fix that problems, and I made the profit endogenous to different variables. There is one that is a clear candidate to affect profit, and is the exchange rate a la Blecker. And also there can be other sort of adjustment possible. For instance, you can include an adjustment rule in order to maintain the debt stock of the private sector in some level, like it will be some behavioral equation that provides an instability to the model, in which firms try to, well, if they are taking debt very quickly or very in accelerated way, they can just increase the markup rate in order to provide with the required funds to finance the investment. With respect to the empirical estimation of the parameters, I do agree with you. Well, I think if you look at the technical report written by me, very long and boring. It had almost 70 pages. So I was trying to cut some information. I agree with you. Probably I got a relevant piece of information for the readers. I just want to say that I made this estimation of parameter with 3 different techniques. In some cases, was required to take it from literature. I try to estimate the majority of them using econometrics, and in some cases, some parameters were estimated by calibration using the initial information we have, the benchmarking information we have in the social account matrix. As an example, I can give you the tax rates model in the same way that Freitas was commenting probably before me. And thank you for the suggestion. They will be really useful in order to improve this project. Sebastian, thank you once again, and thank you everybody for your time.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Sebastian. We have time for a very small, short question, if somebody wants to ask. Otherwise, we can, as the case with Fabio, Freitas, collect the question and send it to Gabriel. I don't see hand raised. So we can now move to the closure of the seminar. Herman Feldman, the chief economist of the central bank, will be giving the closing remarks. Herman?
Well, thank you, Ariel. I will try to be brief considering the time. Let me thank again all the speakers and discussants for participating in this workshop. As I anticipated yesterday, in these 2 days, we have analyzed a variety of macroeconomic models that have only confirmed that there's no single way to formalize the behavior of small open economies. So I would like to finish the workshop by giving a very brief summary of the topics discussed. The first contribution by Professor Razmi yesterday has recourse to a two-sector model to emphasize the structural heterogeneity of many peripheral economies, with surplus labor in the low productivity sector that is gradually absorbed by the favorable sector as the economy expands through profit-led channels, and that it faces restrictions of various types, not only the typical external and distributed constraints, but also supply constraints, in particular capital shortages and the problem of the Dutch disease. The second work presented yesterday by Mariana Garcia-Schmidt shows how the Central Bank of Chile elaborates and calibrates models in small and open economy for policy decision-making and projections. The main tool used is a new Keynesian DSGE model with a variety of sectors, frictions, and capable of accommodating numerous kinds of shocks. To account for the novel phenomena or answer specific questions, the main model is adapted to incorporate those changes that are considered crucial, for instance, the role of migration, and satellite models are created to deal with specific issues, for instance, the distinction between tradable and non-tradable goods. Today, José Luis Oreiro presented a Caldarian balance of payment constraint growth model to show that by favoring the industrial sector through the promotion of a competitive real exchange rate, monetary policy can encourage structural change and the pace of technological progress. In line with the structural hypothesis of development macroeconomics, this result of money-no neutrality suggests that it is not possible to separate macroeconomic policy from long-run considerations. Then Fabio Freitas' work based on the supermultiplier model studies the influence of the composition of autonomous demand on the impact of fiscal policy. He carries simulations to analyze the differential trajectory of 2 hypothetical economies characterized by alternative structural parameters, but the same structural surplus target in terms of GDP. And his main result is that the determining factor of the differential trajectory in the economic growth rate and in the debt to GDP ratio is given by the importance of government spending in total autonomous expenditures. And finally, the work by Gabriel Michelena develops a dynamic stock-flow consistent model for Argentina. This kind of models, as he said, have recourse to social accounting matrices contain the main transactor of the real sector, as well as monetary flows between the different aggregated economic sectors. And the proposed analytical framework allows a series of counterfactual fiscal, tax, monetary, and trade policy exercises to be carried out. So thank you all again. I remind you that the final versions of the papers, hopefully enriched by the comments received during these 2 days, will be published in a forthcoming special issue of Ensayos Económicos. I wish you all a nice afternoon and goodbye. Please take care.